There you go.
Welcome to session 7, the final session in exploring Acts during Easter. A violent wind and tongues of fire, story of Pentecost. The resource has the passage from Acts 2, but it also, as you will see, has passages from various parts of Hebrew scripture. So we're going to approach Pentecost via the Israelite traditions.
And I was just going to ask, out of curiosity for folk, how many people are aware that Pentecost is a Jewish festival?
Yeah.
Yes.
Most of you? Because often we think of it as a Christian thing because we celebrate it as the coming of the Spirit and birthday of the church. And people actually don't realise that Pentecost originated in the Jewish religion. And it's one of 3 feasts that are celebrated by Jews since a very long time ago. And there's various passages in the Torah about the various festivals and what you do at each festival. And they've all got agricultural origins. Passover's main focus is looking at the Exodus story and that freedom that's gained as they're released from slavery and oppression in Egypt. Each one you bring some sort of offering and the law specifies what it is. Sometimes it's a harvest offering. Sometimes it may be, and that can be crops, it can be a beast that you bring. And the last festival is Sukkot, or the Festival of Booths, we often know it. And that's probably the most joyous festival in the Jewish calendar. You never celebrate Sukkot alone. It's meant to be a very communal thing and a very happy time where family and maybe neighbourhoods and synagogues and extended connections you have get together in a Sukkot, and the Sukkot never has the roof quite finished. That's part of the tradition. So you're open to the heavens, and it's based on the idea of a temporary shelter because the Israelites wandered in the desert and lived in temporary shelters. And Sukkot is usually connected with grain or something like barley, wheat, and those sorts of things are bought as a offering when people come to Sukkot. So Passover is a spring harvest. It isn't here, but it certainly is in the northern hemisphere. And there's a complex way of counting up. Well, it seems complex. You count from what happens at Passover, and you count, it's called the counting of the Omer, and you count 50 days. And at 50 days, Pentecost is celebrated. An Omer is a unit of measure, and it was used for barley and other grain offerings, and they are referred to as the Omer.
Worth explaining the 50 days too. Leviticus 21 says that you complete 7 Shabbats. So the Shabbat is the Sabbath, which is the 7th day. So 7 periods completing a Sabbath is 7 weeks, which is 49 days. And so it's the day after the 7 Shabbats. The 50th day, which is the completion of the counting of the Omer.
Yes. And as well as celebrating being a harvest festival, it's also a festival that celebrates the law, which of course is a very important part of Judaism. And it's also a period of partial mourning where Jews would light a candle for an ancestor. So there's various customs attached to, there's the counting of the Omer John's got up there for you, and when it gets to it. With each festival comes a thing called a Megillat, which is a reading from what Hebrew scripture calls the writings.
We had a question before that.
Oh, did we? Where is it?
It's here.
Oh, so we did. Sorry about that. I've gone down too far. All right. So we have a question for you. Christians assume that Pentecost, often they do, assume it was originally a Christian festival, the coming of the Spirit, not a Jewish festival. So our question for you to think about is, why do you think that Luke chose this festival to tell the story of the coming of the Spirit? Why not pick something else? Why not wait till Booths, for instance, or invent an entirely new one? So we want you to cogitate that in your groups this morning. How did you all go with that question? Why do you think Luke chose this festival to tell the story of the coming of the Spirit?
A very good question, which we've been wallowing around
Okay.
How
Any-
did you wallow, Bill?
Well, I thought that there were some good thoughts Gary had. Why is it framed that way? That Luke chose the festival. And didn't the festival? I mean,
Choose him.
if God is active in history, and we sort of believe there's a timeline that after Passover, after that time when there was the Passion and the death of Jesus and his resurrection, that 50 days after that, there's the release of the Spirit. See, if Luke had chosen another festival, if we put it in those terms, it wouldn't be Pentecost, would it?
No, it wouldn't, but it could have been something that he picked himself. It might have been Sukkot. Now, that would have been a long time afterwards because it's in the autumn. Or there could have just been the coming of the Spirit, not associated with any festival whatsoever.
Mm.
But why can't we take this as a little bit of history?
Because it isn't. Not in my opinion.
The
anyway.
Spirit's involved. You've got to give the Spirit credit for stirring things up.
I think if this actually
Can I make
happened,
it-
more people
can I
would have
make it-
noticed
put
other
in a
than the writer of
suggestion?
Luke Acts.
Can I put
Sorry,
in a-
John.
May I put in a suggestion?
Yes, go for it, Colin.
The Festival of Booths, as I understand it, was to remember the time, the 40 years that they were living in tents, wandering
Yes.
around the desert.
Yeah.
Like a lost soul from hell.
It's very quiet.
It follows after Passover, which was the tradition when they remember their escape from slavery. And so Luke's trying to draw a parallel between the joy of finally getting into the promised land with the 40 weeks of wondering what's going to happen next after Jesus has died and they've had various appearances of him. What's going to happen next? That period has to come to an end, just like the period of wandering in the desert had to come to an end. And so it sort of makes a natural link with the joy of getting into the promised land on one hand, that tradition, that old tradition, into the joy of this sort of sudden breaking forth of spirit into and forming a new community that are joined by the Spirit following the risen Christ. So that's my vision as to why he may have chosen it.
And we
Yep.
added on that because it was Shavuot and because all the Jewish families are required to attend to temple things. Am I right about temple things?
Yeah,
Then
they're
Jerusalem,
encouraged to attend. Yeah.
so Jerusalem's going to be flooded with people, and God's such a good marketer that this is a good time to release.
Yeah. Yes. So I think Colin's right. It is about the joy of it. There's some other reasons from the Old Testament, which we're going to explore, but it's about that joy and that coming together and the fact they are all gathered together in a way that you might not get them at a random time that you chose. I think that we can assume Luke did pick this, Bill. I think it is literary. Peter's speech is literary. It's very unlikely he gave this speech as it's reported here. And we've discussed that before when we looked at the beginning at Acts, when we looked at in the ancient world, you constructed speeches for your writings that fitted the occasion. And you may have heard some reports from them, but basically you wrote it and you put into words what should have been said. Because that was part of the ancient genre.
I mean, I would add around that in terms of skepticism about Luke's historical reliability. Pentecost is mentioned, apart from Hebrew scripture, in the New Testament. Pentecost is mentioned only by one other writer, and that's Paul, who just mentions it as a date when he was in 1 Corinthians, I think. in terms of his travel and his missionary activities. So no special weight placed on it there. In John's Gospel, the Spirit is given to the disciples, but that takes place in the upper room when Jesus appears very soon after his resurrection. So there's no 40 days or 50 days, and there's no extended set of appearances. In Matthew, there's no sense of Pentecost because Jesus takes them to a mountain, gives them the Great Commission, and then
Off they go.
So it's I mean, looking at the array of texts, Luke's the only one that actually invests the story with this symbolism and with the 50 days and so on. And as Elizabeth said, alongside the construction of the speech, the construction of the temporal narrative may well be his work. But there's no proof of that. So neither Bill nor Elizabeth is right or wrong. It's just a matter of the weighing of the probabilities and how skeptically you apply your historical methodology, I suppose.
Quite sceptically in this case.
Yeah.
Well, it's like the Gospel of Matthew talking about the matter of the innocents. The odds on that being an historical event are very low. It probably didn't happen. And I think with Pentecost, but Matthew writes it in for a reason because of the Moses typology he's putting on Jesus. And I think Luke's doing this for a reason. And we're about to look at what that reason might be. So the Megillah that we read from that happens with this festival, which is a reading from the writings, is from the book of Ruth. And each Megillah is meant at each festival to tell the story of a heroic, inspiring sort of person from Israel's past. So Ruth is what is set for Pentecost, and it's probably because of it's probably due to a number of things. One is Ruth's devotion and commitment to Naomi, her mother-in-law, the Israelite. And Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." We probably don't realise what commitment that actually is that Ruth is making. She's basically saying she's giving up her entire culture, her family, whatever her religion was, to become essentially like an Israelite. And that means that she would do the appropriate worship, she'd follow the laws and the festivals, she would be expected to live righteously or justly and contribute to the economy, what was going on around her in the community. And if there was a king, which there isn't in the book of Ruth, probably make some sort of commitment to whatever the monarch is needing. So there's a neat little thing with Ruth's name there. When she says, "Your God will be my God," she's implicitly accepting all the 613 commandments given in the Torah. Now, she's probably already following what we call the Noahide commands. There's 7 basic commandments which Jews expected Gentiles to keep, and certainly God-fearers would have observed them. And they're things like, following certain laws about justice and keep living a chaste life or and doing the appropriate kind of rituals, etc. So when we look at that, Ruth has to accept an additional 606 commandments alongside the 7 she's already presumably keeping, that Gentiles are meant to keep as she's married to a Jew. And of course, in Hebrew scripture, every letter has a value, and Ruth's name just happens to add up to 606. What a surprise in the book of Ruth, finding that there.
And by the way, if you're looking at the numbers, I've realised now that the visual I've got is incorrect down the bottom. There's actually 248 positive commands and 365 negative. I don't know why they've got 246, because the website that I got it from said 613, which is correct. Anyway.
They might have been having a bad day.
Yeah,
probably they were.
And being more negative.
And negative just means it's a prohibitive thing, like you shall not. So you shall not kill. And that's why they're called the negative and the positive. The positives are you will observe the Sabbath. So that's what that particular terminology means. So Ruth is read on the day to recall that she accepts the commandments of the Torah, and as remembering that as the same way that Israel accepted the Torah and the giving of the law, because this is what Pentecost celebrates. And when the Spirit comes in Pentecost in Luke's story, we get this miraculous phenomena, which might remind you of something else. And we're looking here at a passage from Exodus. On the morning there was a third day, there was thunder and lightning, there was a thick cloud, there was loud noises, Mount Sinai is wrapped in smoke, and the Lord's descended in fire, and the mountain shakes violently, and Moses and God have this conversation. So you might recognize some of the imagery that is here in Mount Sinai. Luke has drawn on for his coming of the Spirit in Pentecost. As it came with the law on Mount Sinai, so it comes in a very similar way to the disciples who are gathered together and praying. So there's also a special custom that Jews have called Simchat Torah, and this takes place once a year at Sukkot, and it symbolises the love of the Jewish people for the Torah, and expressed in an unusual way. They express it through dancing. And if you ever did one of our biblical culture days, when we did Sukkot, we got them all up dancing to something like Zorba the Greek. It wasn't that, it was a Jewish song. But anyway, we learnt a particular Jewish dance that went with that. And it binds you to each other and to the Torah and to God physically, emotionally. So, and that was to fulfill the command to love God with all your heart, mind, and being. So Luke's picking up some of these ancient Old Testament ideas and symbols. So we've got another question for you. If Pentecost was the festival to focus on the giving of the law, and the story of Ruth the Moabite marrying Boaz the Israelite was read, how does the story which Luke tells about the coming of the Spirit to the early community in Jerusalem resonate with these aspects? What other links might you draw? How does the story of Ruth help? How do these symbols that we find in the book of Exodus help what Luke might be trying to achieve? So that is your task for this particular breakout, Ruth. Okay, how did you go with that question?
So aggressed all over the place.
Anything you'd like to share from your all over the placing?
Let someone else share this time.
Okay.
Well, we did like the way that the story of Ruth fitted in. It was such a powerful story about covenant and commitment.
I've never thought about this before. Scary here. Hadn't thought about this before, about Ruth's name adding up to a particular number, which indicated a number of laws.
Yep.
And so that's a really deliberate thing, and in a construction of a story. And I was wondering whether Ruth was a story or a drama written specifically for this festival.
Oh, that's an interesting concept, because it's quite an old story, and its origins and connections are kind of lost in the mists of times. It's certainly connected with this particular festival, but it's a really interesting question that you're raising. I mean, Ruth is a very clever book generally. It's actually meant to be comedic. We read it and take it terribly seriously. And it's not meant to be taken terribly seriously. There's all sorts of ways where it pokes fun at itself and where it's got its tongue firmly in its literary cheek. Like the opening of the book of Ruth, we have Chilon and Mahlon, where it says that Naomi has these two sons, Chilon and Mahlon. And we read that, and they're transliterated from the Hebrew into English. So it's just the English equivalents of the Hebrew letters. And we just think that they're names, and they're not names. They're actually the Hebrew words for consumption and sickness. Oh. So when it says her son's name, consumption and sickness, died, no one is surprised. But,
Mm.
you know, you don't open a book like that unless you mean it to be funny. So I would hazard a guess that Ruth's name, adding up to the number of laws she's got to accept, also has some comedic value as well as a serious value. It's meant to be funny that this Moabite, who, by the way, is one of the only two nations banned in the Torah for ever becoming Israelites, or, you know, the Israelites associating with them or going with their countries. It's interesting that she's picked as a Moabite, and her name actually makes up the rest of the commandments. So I think the author is making some points here, and one of them's funny.
Mm.
So next time you read Ruth, Gary, read it with an idea that it's funny, and it may reveal different things to you.
It may. That's right. We bring a mindset, don't we? Yeah.
We do bring a mindset, and if you just read it in the English translations without a lot of good footnotes, you would never know these things.
Gary could read it in Hebrew.
What was that, Bill?
Maybe Gary could read it in the Hebrew.
But the other thing,
Yeah, that is funny.
is that given it's got all of that humour in it, it tells a story which, I mean, the story's remembered and the story's part of Scripture, so it tells a story which has a serious point, a significant point, and that's
Yes.
the connection with this festival. But
Yeah,
it
and I
also,
would say humour helps sell a point.
yeah,
It makes it more palatable and
Yes,
easy
that's
to
right,
grasp.
yeah.
And I think that's why it's written in the way it is.
yeah. Well, we get our news from Charlie Pickering. That's the best way to. If Charlie's not on, nothing's happening. No.
That's right.
Do Jewish people read this story with humour?
Yes, absolutely they do, because they understand Hebrew, unlike us.
Yeah.
And they understand it starts in this funny way with these boys who are called sickness and consumption, or sickness and disease, if you want. You know they're going to die. You don't have two children called that are going to survive. It's just not going to happen. And Naomi, of course, her name means sweet, and she becomes Mara. And then, of course, they have to flee from Bethlehem because there's a famine, and Bethlehem means house of bread.
House of bread. Yeah.
You know, there's all sorts of these little funny things in there.
I mean, our experience of rabbis in real life, as well as in reading rabbis from past years, is that humour is invested in the whole interpretive process of Judaism. Judaism is an incredibly serious religion. If you take it seriously, every single action you do, every single day, needs to adhere to Torah, because you're reflecting that you're in covenant with God. That's incredibly serious. But running through all of that, there are all of these word plays and stories and games and all sorts of things that even in the most serious moment, there's humour. It's something that has, you know, the British heritage is really separated.
Yes. And every rabbi we've ever known is not only a rabbi, they're orators and they're stand-up comedians, every single one of them. So, yeah.
I thought there was sit down and writing comedians.
Oh, well.
No, there's stand-up ones too.
Well done, Sharon. You could make a rabbi yet.
Working on it. I've got a stand-up comedian friend in New Zealand.
Could we
back
say
to our question?
Oh, my question.
Yeah, could we say that humor is part of Judaism, the way they relate to each other? I mean, Jesus tells parables, and most of the parables have double meaning or humor attached, like the camel and the needle and things like that. Yeah.
Absolutely, John. And we want to read Jesus terribly seriously too. And he did have a sense of humour.
Yeah.
And some of the stuff he says is very witty. And we don't give enough attention to that side, I think, of either Jesus himself or the way he's written about and the way the writers frame that. But yes, there are funny things in it. What else could you draw from the story at Sinai and the story of Ruth? Anything else?
I had to duck out, and so I'll consider Ruth is a subversive story.
Yes, it
You've
is.
got Ruth the Moabite, who becomes the kind of great grandmother of King David or something.
Yes, she does.
Yeah.
And so here we've got the royal line, partly of the worst kind of person, the Moabite. And there is something about inclusion going on, which is interesting.
Yes, I think that's a point, and John will pick that up in the next section we do. But yes, that's absolutely.
Oh, I thought you were going to say I'll pick it up and talking about British people marrying German people and Greek people too. Sorry.
Okay, what about Sinai's story? Just before we leave this.
Yeah, can I just say, thought that came to me was that in the Sinai story, only Moses hears what God's saying. The rest hear it as thunder. This is reversed at Pentecost,
Yes.
where everyone hears these words, presumably divine words, in their own language.
Absolutely. So it's moved from just an exclusive person of communication that's broadened out to communicating with everyone is there.
Yeah.
And then they communicate with everyone who's there. So there's this knock-on effect where the communication is much broader than that. But it is worth noting that the symbols Luke uses of fire and the noise are similar to Sinai. So one would think that a whole pile of listening Jews hearing that, it would evoke that story for them. And that's fitting, of course, because Pentecost is the festival focused on the giving of the law. So you'd expect some signs and symbols around it that reflect the original giving of the law.
There's no hint of influences by Elijah in the cave, the still small voice, the rushing wind, the fire, the flames.
No, because God wasn't in any of them, if you remember the story. He heard the flames and God wasn't there, and the thunder and God wasn't there, and all the noise and God wasn't there. And then God comes in a still small voice. Elijah is a different thing. Elijah is hearing God in a way that is not Baal, because Baal is a god of storms and war and thunder and lightning. So God is not in any of those aspects with Elijah. God is in something that's the total opposite, but you'd expect that because the context is a contest with hearts and minds for people who want to worship Baal.
But you could then say that all of these visual signs were present, but not where God was. God was in the Holy Spirit that was being diverted, and in the humans speaking out all of these different languages.
I think that's probably pushing it a bit, Sharon.
Oh, let's push the boundaries.
Simply because the Spirit is taking the form of a plane and is sitting on their heads, so it's hard to say God isn't in it.
Oh, God's in the flame and in the utterances.
See,
but
with Elijah, God isn't.
He isn't, but
No.
they are still visual signs of what's going on to, hey, look at this. What's happening here?
Possibly.
And
So
somebody in our group
sign.
spoke of how the people on the ground only heard the rumbling, and they didn't actually hear. Moses was hearing
Yes.
the word of the Lord and seeing it written on the as the law. Yeah.
I would look at it as the power of God, the way that the picture is given. You know, the power of God was revealed at that point, and the language comes later. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think you meant to interpret this as God's power and spirit are present in these symbolic flames and in the noise and the rushing of the wind. You know, it's the coming of something very powerful. All right, we should move on to our next bit.
So we're going to think about who was there at this Jewish festival, and it's the answer is very clear. Verse 5 of Acts says, "Those present were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem." So they were not Gentiles, although they had come from nations other than Israel. They were Jews living in diaspora, in the dispersion. And ever since the exile of the Northern Kingdom in 721 and then the Southern Kingdom in 587, there have been people adhering to the law of Moses, but living in countries that were not were not Jewish countries. So there's archaeological evidence of Jewish settlements right around the eastern, northern, and parts of the Mediterranean and on the northern edge of Africa. And yet this story is embedded in this 2-volume work, which we've said quite clearly, for those of you who've done the whole Luke thing before, that it's oriented to the gospel going to the whole world, and that Luke has put this in his story from the very beginning. In chapters 2 and 3, there are indications that this is for all flesh. This is for the salvation of the Gentiles as well as for glory to Israel. It runs through in Acts right to the end, where Paul is in Rome, which is the capital of the major empire. And yet, even though there's this Gentile gospel to the Gentiles orientation in Luke's story, this event is gathering only Jews. They've come from all the nations around Israel. And there's interesting maps that you can, first of all, yeah, there's prophecies that this seems to be fulfilling. Maybe the scene in Acts in Jerusalem is fulfilling for Luke in a new way the prophecies that Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Isaiah have given about gathering you from all the nations, all the places where I've driven you, bringing you back to the place from which I sent you into exile, taking you from the nations, gathering you into your own land. This is a prophecy that is particularly potent in the light of modern, recent events. I mean, the whole thing about whose land is it in Israel-Palestine is so contentious, and both Jews and Muslim Arabs have claim to historical, occupancy and historical ownership, if you like. So these are some of the texts which lie behind that ideology, but they may well be informing what Luke is doing about gathering the people from the nations. Indeed, it could be that there's reference to the prophecy of Isaiah himself, not just 3rd Isaiah, but 1st Isaiah. Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths, all the nations streaming into Jerusalem for that purpose. So at any rate, whether it is predicting that Gentile surge of interest or whether it is referring to the Jews, Luke identifies in the narrative where they come from. They'd come from the east. They'd come from Parthia, Medes and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, all of those eastern countries in Babylon and surrounding areas. They'd come from the north, starting from Judea, from Cappadocia, from Pontus, from Asia, and from Pamphylia. They'd come from the west. He refers to Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, and Cretans from the island of Crete. And then they've come from the south, from Arabia. So this map gives you an indication of where the people are coming from for this festival. These are faithful Jews living in dispersion, gathering in Jerusalem for this particular festival. And in fact, there are medieval maps that depict the world with Jerusalem at the center. Jerusalem as the navel of the world, surrounded by all the then known nations of sort of Eastern and Europe. So Jews living in the dispersion came to Jerusalem from all nations, symbolic. The 12 that are listed, I think, might be symbolic of coming from everywhere. And Jerusalem is the centre to which they come. So, in the light of the prophetic texts that we've looked at about coming back to the land, how do you now see Pentecost? And maybe just pondering this, are you surprised that in the story the Spirit falls only on Jews? Why are you surprised, or why are you not surprised?
How did you go with that question? In the light of the prophetic text, how do you now see Pentecost? Maybe you haven't changed your point of view. Maybe you have. Should the Spirit have fallen only on Jews? Why or why not?
At this point in time, it was only on Jews, and we had a really interesting conversation around that.
Yes. Yes, in our modern context, that's probably not, it probably doesn't sit quite as well.
But when you think about that, and that was great the way you and John introduced those texts about this is the end time. We'll all come back to Jerusalem. End time, God's going to appear in flesh any moment now.
Yes.
And we're having this fabulous party, and then all of a sudden, other people come to the party. What's that about? I don't want them here, because this is the Jewish end time. Give us a break.
Yes. Though Jewish end time did involve Gentiles, it was just in a different way.
And I have written in an essay somewhere that most Pharisaic writings was end time, and a lot of doom and gloom. I mean, I'm still the concept that it falls on. I mean, the majority. I would argue that there were Gentiles in that crowd.
Let's check. Says Luke doesn't say they're there.
No, but he doesn't say they're not there. But
well,
just
you could, if they were God-fearers, if they were Gentiles that were attracted to the local synagogue and hadn't yet taken the final step for men's circumcision, the sign of the covenant, hadn't yet taken that final step. And there are God-fearers later in Acts, so you can read them back into the story, which some people do,
Yeah.
So I think we can certainly assume that God-fearers were there, but he does specify it's Jews.
Yeah, percentage-wise. So when we did 2 weeks ago the Gentile Pentecost of Peter, and even though it's earlier in the lectionary, time-wise it would have been later.
Yes, that's right.
That's right.
Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah, we like the big celebration of Pentecost, so we come back to chapter 1.
Yeah, we've actually got 2 big celebratory Pentecost stories, which Luke makes a lot of fuss about. Acts chapter 2 is long. Acts chapter 10 is long and repeated in chapter 11. So, in case you overlooked it.
So should we adjust the lectionary then?
Yeah, well,
it would in some ways make more sense, Sharon, because you're quite right. It does chronologically follow this one. So it's like what Mark says, first to the Jews, then the Gentiles. And this theme's developed in the book of Acts because Paul says it a few times. We'll take it to the Gentiles. If you're not going to listen, then we're off to people who will.
Yes.
Perhaps we could still have Acts 2 on the day of Pentecost and then just minimise or remove that festival that happens on the Sunday after Pentecost and have that as the Gentile Pentecost Act.
That would be nice, but we can still talk about concrete at Caesarea Maritima.
Yes.
Jen and I had a lot of fun with concrete.
So coming from a background of Hinduism, where it's a very strong religion, ancient religion, and it started with Saivism and then it became Hinduism, where Henotheism or whatever. I mean, why should the question could be asked by them or on their behalf? Why should Jews be the people that God should choose?
Good question. Fair and to the point. And who's got the answer? That would be no one.
God. God's got the answer.
I mean, it's not dissimilar from other very, very ancient religions that saw they were the ones that had the real God with the real power. And, they were all similar. It's just Christianity inherited the Jewish tradition, as it were, and evolved from that. So that's why we follow that. But if you as you say, John, if you look at other ancient texts, they've also got something special about why the God's talking to them.
Mm. But Morna Hookup set out really well how the Jews were not there and the Hebrew people were not to hold God tightly and separately and be Pharisees that are separated. They were there to bring to all people, and they didn't.
A light to the
And-
nations.
Yes,
to
a
the nations,
light to the
yeah.
nations. And it
The
wasn't till
problem with that is the light to the nations is second Isaiah. I've said many, many times in these studies, if there was no second Isaiah, there would be no New Testament.
Mm,
Because just about all of that stuff, Sharon, is based on second Isaiah.
yes,
If
yes,
you take it out of the mix of the Hebrew Bible, you don't have that light to the nations, bring in all the Gentile stuff. It disappears with Deuteronomy.
yes, yes.
So that's part of the problem,
Mhm.
I suppose, when we look at this, because there's this one prophet that we're making a great deal out of, and probably ignoring a whole lot of other prophets that have God literally stomping on the nation, crushing and just generally destroying them. So it sits there as this sort of anomaly in these prophetic texts of let's kill the nations because we don't like them very much.
Yes, yes. And of course, Christians jump on all of this and go, woohoo. Yeah.
Yeah, so it is a bit, it's an interesting thing when you make that argument and say the Jews said, well, no, they didn't. Some of them did.
Mm.
And who, we don't even know how many of the Orthodox kind of regular Jewish people even thought Deutero-Isaiah was a great idea. They might have been more into third Isaiah, who has this analogy of God stomping the nations in the winepress like grapes. And it's disgusting. It's a terrible image. They might have been following that one. So it's just hard to know in the ancient world, what were they grabbing onto? Christians grabbed Deutero-Isaiah, but it doesn't necessarily follow that Jews grabbed it. Having said that, Jews have always maintained that righteous Gentiles who follow these 7 Noahide laws will always attain, will be welcome in the kingdom of God. They've always maintained that. In heaven, if you like, if you're reading the eschatological stuff that you referred to earlier, Sharon, these apocalyptic writings. Jews have always said that. It's an interesting point because you're still not a Jew if you like that. And that the early church argued about it, we know from the letter of Galatians, because what Paul says there makes it clear that there's a dispute about whether you follow the law or not follow the law that's going on.
Part of our discussion was just sort of saying to each other how much we're enjoying learning so much from you and John about Luke and Acts and how it all holds together, and then the conversation partly said something like, but most people just want to know the living a good life and being a good Christian or whatever it may be. They're not interested in studying this like we are studying it now. And then there's John's point, which is really pertinent for our time, and that is that every culture has its foundational stories.
Yes.
And most Christians aren't even aware of their foundational story. They've got the Reader's Digest version, not the ins and outs of it. And it helps us. One, we need to be respectful of our own story and learn it better, know it better. But also we need to be respectful of other people's cultures' foundational stories.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, that's very important.
Yeah. Because God has been revealing himself from the beginning.
Yes.
In his own ways, according to the different cultural understanding, according to what they could understand about God. Now, whenever I baptized Hindus into Christianity, not that I was a proselyting type, but whatever I did at that time, I kept telling them, look here, there is only one God. You called this God by a different name. We call our God Father through his son Jesus, and you are not changing religion. Don't feel guilty about it. You are actually accepting an uncle as your own father. Like there's a story in a movie where a little boy, mother and father separated. He didn't know, but he got attracted towards his father, who had the similar mannerism. And then one day he found out that he was the father, and then he called him Appa. All this time he called him Mama, uncle. So it's just the way to understand. Otherwise, Hindus go through a guilt feeling of leaving their people, leaving their religion, leaving the culture, and so much so in the 1970s during indigenous time, good number of Hindus and Buddhists went back to their own religion.
Well, thanks for that, John. We should go to our last part now, where we look at violent wings and tongues of flame, because we've got 10 minutes left, I think, John.
Okay, so there's a mass of noise, the hearing of tongues. The Greek word for tongue, the actual item in our mouth, is glossa, and the word that comes from that is glossia, which can refer to physical tongues, or it can refer to what that tongue contributes to producing, which is speaking. Tongue needs to work with other parts of the body, but the tongue can also mean language. And we have that in English. When we say tongue, we can be referring to the physical item or to the language the person is speaking. So there are two compound words in Greek. Greek is good at joining words together to form compound words. There are two compound words that are quite significant that describe speaking in tongues in the two most infamous passages where that appears. It appears elsewhere, like in Acts 10, but in Acts 2 and in 1 Corinthians 14 or 12 to 14, we have the phenomena of speaking in tongues. And I want to make the case, which not every scholar agrees with, it's debated territory, but I want to make the case that they're different phenomena, although it might sound like the same kind of mess to an outsider. In Acts, Luke, the reason that Luke mentions all those countries is that he is indicating that people were speaking in those languages in the gathering, and that is xenoglossia. The xenos meaning foreign, as in xenophobia that we still use today. So these were known, identifiable languages that sounded like a jumble of mess to those that didn't know them, but to those who knew Parthian or Median or Latin or whatever, it was a known identifiable language. So they were speaking in foreign languages, foreign tongues. Whereas what's happening in Corinth might sound the same. It's a jumble of mess, but it's what Paul refers to as speaking with the tongues of angels. They are incomprehensible sounds which make no sense to anyone except for the person who is gifted by the Spirit with the gift of interpretation. And so Paul wants to bring order to the chaotic mess of worship happening in Corinth and says, if you speak in a tongue that God has given you, the Spirit has given you, then stop when you've finished, no one else speak, and let the person with the gift of interpretation interpret what has been said before the next one comes along. The experiences I've had a long time ago now of Pentecostal charismatic kind of gatherings haven't followed that rule. They've followed the guidance that speaking in tongues is good, as Paul says, but they haven't followed the guidance about interpretation. I don't know what it's like now. So I think these are spiritual gifts in Paul's mind, and yet he downplays the importance of speaking in tongues, and he wants to bring things into order, which is his big thing in the latter part of through about most of all of 1 Corinthians. So two different phenomena which have different origins, even though they might sound somewhat similar if you were to experience both. But for the people in Jerusalem, in Luke's story, hearing these strange sounds, and then some people say, oh no, I know what they're saying. They're speaking in a language I learnt, or in my language, they're saying such and such. And so that mess of sounds is actually bringing together people from all over and having them all praising God for what has happened. And so the one suggestion is that this story might be a symbolic, there's lots of symbolism invested into the Pentecost story, as we can see. It may well be for Luke a symbolic reference back to the Babel story where God says, come, let us go down and confuse their language there so that they will not understand one another's speech. And ever since then, people lived with different languages, which meant that they needed to translate and to try and understand and communicate. But at Pentecost, all of those languages come together and other people start to hear those languages. They're all proclaiming praise to God. So the final question is about this line of interpretation. Can the story of Pentecost be interpreted as a symbolic overturning of the divisions that were set up in the Babel story? And this almost sounds like an essay question. What reasons support your interpretation?
Okay, Sherry, did you want to say something?
Yeah, so Brooke Prentice, who's in my class at Pilgrim, was on By the Well. I don't know if anybody listens to By the Well.
I know of it. I don't listen to it. Yeah.
They were talking about Pentecost in the last episode, and she was saying it, relating the story of Pentecost into an Aboriginal context, and that context was the Bunya Nut Festival, where they had people, I forget where they held it, but they had people from as far south as Sydney coming to wherever they were for this festival. It's like this big celebration meeting of lots of people, and they all had their own languages or dialects of languages, but were still able to kind of understand what each other was saying and get the gist of what they were saying.
It's like the Bogon Moth Festival that was in the Canberra region. Similar thing there. You had a lot of nations coming when the Bogon Moths arrived in numbers, and they'd be together there, and there was a feast of Bogon Moths and a festival there.
Yep.
So it's a similar thing. So
yeah.
A lot of scholars do believe that this does reverse the story of the Tower of Babel, where different languages were done deliberately by God to stop the people getting together and plotting. But here, the Spirit brings them back together again, and they can all hear and understand it. Sharon, your words of wisdom.
That's all well and good at that particular point in time. But as John has said, more often that when people are talking in tongues that are the languages of angels, and there's no understanding.
Yes.
But the beauty in the scientific study they've done, that when people speak in tongues and they look at the bits of the brain that light up, it is basically the Holy Spirit taking over your whole brain and putting you into an attitude of worship or of intercession or lament beyond understanding.
Yeah, well, it's kind of an emotional response to what's happening at the time in some ways, but that's what is in Corinth. It's not what's in Acts, which clearly says they can all understand what's being said in their own language, which is not Tower of Babel. It's the opposite. Yes.
And I wonder if they
another reversal from Babylon. In the story of Babylon, what the people are trying to do is to build a tower up to heaven.
Yep.
In the story of Pentecost,
heaven comes down.
They're on the ground, and heaven sends the Spirit to them.
Yeah.
It's heaven contacting the people rather than the people trying to assert their strength by getting into heaven.
Absolutely. That's a really good point that's happening. And God gets over his fit of pique that he had at the time of the Tower of Babel and, drops all this glorious goodness on everyone that's there. Bill, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just making a comment that the Festival of the Bogong is also known as the Australian Senate.
Oh, Bill. Bill. I'm going to quote you on that.
Ignoring Bill's political humour there, does anyone have any other comments they want to make about the story of Pentecost, either this question or just generally? Or ask a question if something's puzzled you? I mean, like a lot of things that the gospel writers write, it's really dependent on a lot of the Old Testament and understanding how it's drawing on prophets and narratives and different parts of the symbols of the Old Testament really does help us bring the story even more to life and understand, you know, the depth of what is being portrayed here in this particular act of the Spirit and of God.
I was telling in my group, Elizabeth, that God understands Tamil language.
I'm sure God does understand Tamil language.
I mean, Pentecost is that's one of the messages, that God understands our own languages, soul languages, that we can worship in our own language, and I need not talk Jewish language or Aramaic or whatever that we are called. But wherever we are, from the margin, we can always, reach out to God, and God reaches out to us.
Yes.
And in terms of different languages, incredible journey of understanding not only the language, but the culture behind it and the way we interpret the world or see the world behind it. And again, the foresight of the Uniting Church in its forward, I forget the correct title now, to the Constitution. And God was in the land well before the colonizers arrived. And our First Nations people had a genuine relationship with the living God.
That's exactly, Gary, we say about Sri Lanka before Christianity came in the 16th century, with Portuguese, Dutch, and the English. God was there. There was it's not a vacuum, spiritual vacuum. People were spiritual, and people reach out to God, and God reached out to the people.
Well, it's a bit silly to think that the God we worship as creator of our whole earth somehow only spoke to this tiny, tiny portion of it and wasn't anywhere else. That doesn't make a particle of sense. If you're the creator, then you're everywhere, and every part of that world you've created is important, and all those people are important. And to think that God's concentrating on this tiny strip of land to the exclusion of everyone else really doesn't fit the idea of a universal creator and a God of love at all.
We can wax on about colonialism too.
Yes, yes, indeed.
Yes, time is up for today, and time is up for this series. We're going to take a break of a couple of weeks because Pentecost Sunday is going to be so exhausting. We're going to need time to recover.
Yes,
well, I'm doing Pentecost at Dungog Church, so I'll probably be ruined at least on that day.
Elizabeth's inflicting her all-age Pentecost onto...
Not that I can do it in full glory in Dungog, because it's got a raked floor with pews, and that's just so inflexible. But anyway, we're doing a version of it that's milder.
I've been...
Elizabeth, I finished 50 years of ministry on the 4th of May.
That's a really good place to finish.
Last Sunday was a celebration of 100-odd people came to celebrate it. And in the Methodist Church, I was inducted on the 4th of May, 1974.
Wow.
Yeah, well, that's quite a milestone, John. So congratulations on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth and John, for sharing your knowledge and
Yeah.
your experience. And we can all celebrate with John and Elizabeth and John. And yay! I've been sitting cutting up streamers for the church, which is transforming it. We've promised to send you photos.
Oh, yes, that sounds wonderful. So I think I'll give out some instruments, and I might see if I can find some coloured streamers and put them together that people can just sit in their little pew spot and wave away. But there is a tiny Sunday school here, so I do have a handful of kids, so we'll see what we can do.
Power control. Yay.
Yes.
I get to do a baptism on the 23rd of June, first for a while.
Excellent.
Very exciting. Yeah.
That will be exciting.
Well, John will send out more information when we're starting the Gospel of Mark, and we'll be following through the lectionary readings